Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Let's take up the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by looking at this column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column has been written by Mr. Jayant Prasad, who happens to be a former Indian diplomat and as well as a former Director General of the IDSA or the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, which is a Delhi-based think tank funded by the Ministry of Defence. In this column, he examines the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic and tries to address the controversy surrounding China's role in the breakout of the pandemic. See, last year when the pandemic emerged, several theories were circulated regarding its origin, one of which included an accidental or deliberate leak of the virus at a high-security bio-research lab located in Wuhan. At the center of this controversy was the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which has been designated as a biosafety level 4 facility, which happens to be the highest safety level allotted to a bioresearch facility. At such BSL 4 facilities, advanced research would be carried out on several deadly pathogens, and the highest level of precautions would be taken in line with the BSL 4 standards. So as the breakout of the COVID-19 pandemic was traced to the city of Wuhan, the Chinese state pushed forward a theory that the outbreak had occurred at a wet market, and it strongly promoted a theory that this was a case of natural zoonosis, where the virus had made a jump from animals to humans. Around the same time, several experts around the world, they started pointing fingers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, indicating a possible leakage, either accidental or deliberate, at this biosafety level 4 facility. But back then, this lab leak theory was quickly dismissed as a conspiracy theory, not just by China, but also by several experts around the world, including the US government. But now, almost a year later, these concerns are back in news because circumstantial evidence has been building up in support of this theory, which has eventually led US President Joe Biden to ask the US intelligence community to reinvestigate the origins of COVID, and he has asked for a report within the next 90 days in order to determine whether the virus was man-made and whether is there any Chinese connection to it. This theory and angle has gained more traction in the last few weeks based on several investigative reports that have appeared in the media and as well as based on the findings of an anonymous group on Twitter known as Drastic, which is essentially a volunteer group who call themselves Decentralized Radical Autonomous Search Team investigating COVID-19. And over the last few months, they have dedicated themselves to pick out any evidence to indicate that the virus was man-made. And some of their findings, which support this lab leak theory at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, has been gaining more acceptability of late. And these emerging reports have pushed the United States and as well as several governments around the world to consider the possibility that COVID-19 broke out not as a case of natural zoonosis, but maybe as a result of an accidental or deliberate leak at Wuhan Institute of Virology. These concerns are being increasingly flagged by several intelligence officials as well, and this is what leads the author to examine these possibilities. He points out that American intelligence and even former Israeli intelligence officials had raised safety concerns about the biosafety standards of Wuhan Institute of Virology even before the pandemic. See, today, the field of biotechnology and genetic sciences, especially genetic engineering, is so advanced that it is possible to work on existing natural pathogens and engage them in gain-of-function research, which will allow us to manipulate the pathogens to make them more lethal. And such gain-of-function research has always been a source of controversy, especially with regard to its ethical dilemma. Through gain-of-function research, it is possible to make pathogens more transmissible or more infectious, and it is even possible to make it even more deadlier by increasing its mortality rate. And through specific interventions in the genetic structure of the pathogen, it's even possible to make the disease untreatable, or it's also possible that the antidote and the vaccines to these diseases can be kept limited in the hands of the developers of these pathogens. But please don't assume that gain-of-function research is carried out solely for the purposes of biological weapons, because this field of research also has a very important civilian application. See, gain-of-function is a field of research that is focused on growing generations of microorganisms under certain conditions that cause mutations in a virus. These experiments are termed gain of function because they involve manipulating the pathogen in such a way that they gain an advantage with regard to their functions, such as increased transmissibility. Such gain of function experiments are very much needed because they allow scientists to better predict the emerging diseases and any possible pandemics of the future. And it helps them to study emerging infectious diseases so that they can develop vaccines and even develop potential treatments for these diseases. Usually, there are two routes through which gain of function research is carried out. One is through genetic engineering, and the other is through a technique known as serial passaging. In genetic engineering, as you might know, the genes are edited, the genetic code is edited to modify the virus in a way that is predetermined by the scientists. Whereas serial passaging allows the pathogen to grow under different circumstances, and then the scientists observe the changes. For example, the pathogen may be first grown in one environment, and then a portion of it may be taken out and allowed to grow in different sets of controlled environments. The process is continuously repeated to allow for various mutations of the pathogen, and the final product is compared to the original pathogen to understand how the microbe has changed its genetic code. So essentially, serial passaging encourages mutations of the virus or the pathogen, and it allows the scientists to predict future diseases, future pandemics, develop vaccines and treatments. But however, there are a lot of ethical concerns around this field of research because this sensitive field of research could result in an accidental or deliberate introduction of the deadly pathogen into the open. If the pathogens that are being studied or the ones that are being modified through gain of function research, if they leak out, they could have a deadly impact on the entire world as they would have the potential to trigger such deadly pandemics. So now the emerging concern is that the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is at the center of this controversy, was indeed involved in such gain of function research, and it is known to have worked on several strains of coronaviruses. And in a more serious development, it has been alleged that some of this research which was going on at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was actually funded by American institutes, including the National Institute of Health and the National Institute for Allergy and Infectious Diseases. While these allegations have been denied by the US, the writer points out that it is quite possible that the US was funding such controversial research in a Chinese lab because conducting the same research in American labs would have been ethically more controversial. This also brings to light the controversial role of a scientist known as Dr. Peter Daszak, who is said to have funded such research on coronaviruses at the Wuhan Institute of Virology through his institution known as the Eco Health Alliance. So these allegations that have come out raises two distinct possibilities. One, is it possible that COVID-19 was a possible outcome of a Chinese biological weapons program? Or was it a case of gain of function research going on at the lab, and was there an accidental leakage? Several investigative reports, including the reports brought out by Drastek, has presented a lot of circumstantial evidence to point fingers at China, and this has even led to serious questions being raised about possible American funding of this research. In fact, just a few months back, to investigate the origins of COVID, the World Health Organization had constituted a team, and it even conducted its examination on the ground in Wuhan. At the end, the WHO team couldn't conclude whether the pandemic was a result of an accidental lab leakage. See, this theory is being explored by the WHO as well, and the WHO has not taken this theory off the table because in the past as well, there have been several diseases which were a result of man-made pathogens which accidentally jumped out of laboratory facilities. Take for example smallpox. The deadly smallpox infection was a result of one such research which went wrong. Even other diseases such as plague, anthrax, H5N1, H1N1, they've all been connected to lab leakage incidents. And in fact, back in 2010, there was even a global outcry over gain of function research that was carried out on the H5N1 virus, which had again been funded by the US government. Eventually, the US government had to suspend this research based on ethical concerns, and the WHO even brought out a guidance document on this subject known as Dual Use Research of Concern. That is gain of function research which will have civilian applications and as well as military applications. So the writer's argument is that the ongoing investigation into the origins of COVID-19 should consider all the possibilities, including natural zoonosis or natural transmission, or accidental leakage from a lab, or even possible deliberate leakage from a lab. However, China, on the other hand, has been consistently impeding and disrupting investigations since last year, and even the WHO team that visited China wasn't given complete access to all the data. The investigative reports that have come out have brought out several evidences of concern, which points fingers at China's role in disrupting an honest investigation. Amateur investigators and volunteer reporters have stumbled upon evidence that back in 2012, that there was one incident in one of China's mines where several workers contracted an infection with symptoms similar to COVID-19, and few experts are pointing out that this could have been the initial version of the SARS virus. According to several reports, these virus strains were later brought to the Wuhan Institute of Virology for gain-of-function research, and interestingly, just a few months before the pandemic broke out in 2019, several researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were reported sick, but China has failed to provide sufficient data in this regard to dismiss these claims or concerns. The research group at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which was funded by American institutions, had earlier claimed to have developed around 100 new variants of the SARS virus, and there are valid concerns being expressed by several scientists, experts, and intelligence officials that there might have been a leakage of this deadly pathogen at the Wuhan Institute. It's on the basis of these reports that the US president has ordered a thorough investigation by the US intelligence agencies, and he has called for a report within 90 days. But now that enough time has been lost, and since China has made every effort to impede and hamper these investigations, the writer says that it might be almost impossible to find conclusive evidence now which would allow us to prove the lab leak theory. But based on circumstantial evidence, and based on any future evidence that might come out, the writer calls for a global debate regarding ethical concerns surrounding gain-of-function research, and he calls for further strengthening the Biological Weapons Convention to prevent any similar lab incidents in the future. The Biological Weapons Convention was brought out in 1972, and there are 183 member states which have signed and ratified the convention. Even countries like India, US, China, they're all part of it. But however, one of the biggest drawbacks of the convention is that it has no mechanism for verification, compliance, and enforcement. If you remember the other day, in a daily quiz, we discussed the Chemical Weapons Convention. Under this, we spoke about the OPCW, or the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, which is responsible for verification of the claims made by countries regarding their chemical weapon stockpiles. And OPCW can also conduct investigation and inspection in order to ensure compliance and enforce the provisions of the Chemical Weapons Convention. On similar lines, there is a need for a mechanism that could provide for verification, compliance, and enforcement of the Biological Weapons Convention as well. This convention, also known as the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, is basically a disarmament treaty which effectively bans biological and toxin weapons by prohibiting their development, production, acquisition, transfer, stockpiling, and usage. But unfortunately, it doesn't have any mechanism to verify or enforce these provisions, and the writer calls upon the global community to draw lessons regarding the origins of COVID-19 and the mystery that surrounds its origins, and hence he makes a case for strengthening the enforcement and verification mechanism under the Biological Weapons Convention. Now let's look at another column which examines Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's embrace of Buddhism. See, one of India's founding fathers and one of the key architects of the Indian Constitution was not only heavily influenced by the teachings of Buddhism, but he eventually embraced Buddhism as well. And obviously, the social, political, and philosophical teachings of Buddhism would have left a deep imprint on the thought process of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and thereby had an indirect influence on the Indian society and the Indian polity. See, this topic comes up for discussion in the light of a book that has been written by former Union Minister Jairam Ramesh, in which he examines the importance of a poem known as The Light of Asia that was written in 1879 by Sir Edwin Arnold. Sir Edwin Arnold was a leading scholar and thinker of his time, and he was also an Indophile who took great interest in Indian culture and in Indian studies. During his brief stay in India during the British rule, he was heavily influenced by the teachings of Lord Gautam Buddha and brought out his life and his teachings and his philosophies through this popular poem known as The Light of Asia. This poem is credited with India's cultural awakening and social transformation, and this poem is single-handedly credited with making Buddhism popular in the Western world. It essentially introduced the Western world to the teachings and philosophies of Lord Gautam Buddha, and it also left a deep impact on several Indian leaders, including Mahatma Gandhi, Swami Vivekananda, Jawaharlal Nehru, and of course Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. All these Indian leaders, they read the works of Sir Edwin Arnold, and his revival of Buddhist ideology and philosophy through this poem did have a deep influence on Indian leaders. See, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who was born into a Dalit family, was one of the victims of the oppressive caste system of Hinduism. The sufferings he had to face as a result of caste-based discrimination and violence led him to openly target and criticize the inherent inequality in Hinduism, which was a direct result of its oppressive caste system. In 1936, this led Dr. B.R. Ambedkar to deliver a historic speech known as the Annihilation of Caste, through which he brought out the caste-based inequality in the Indian society and he renounced Hinduism. That is, he renounced or gave up his religion of birth, and nearly 2 decades later in 1956, he converted to Buddhism, and along with him, several lakh Dalit families in India also embraced Buddhism. So clearly, the thinking of Ambedkar, his faith, his belief, had a huge impact on the Indian society, and in many ways it continues to influence the Indian polity as well. So during these 2 decades, that is between 1936 and 1956, Dr. Ambedkar had immersed himself into studying various religions and comparing them. So before he actually converted to Buddhism and embraced its ideals and thoughts, he spent nearly 20 years since he renounced Hinduism to study various religions. And this comparative study of Dr. Ambedkar led him to conclude that Buddhism is the best suited religion for his faith and belief, as it provided him an opportunity to reform himself, because according to Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the teachings of Buddha and the philosophies contained within Buddhism provides for social and political freedom, which otherwise may not be available in the other faiths. He brought out the findings of his study through his essay, Buddha and Future of His Religion, which was published in 1950 in the monthly magazine of Kolkata's Mahabodhi Society. It's a very popular essay because through this essay, Ambedkar brought out the key philosophical differences between Buddhism and the other popular religions, based on the extent of social and political equality that they granted. In this essay, Dr. Ambedkar pointed out that Lord Buddha always projected himself as a regular human, as a regular common man, whereas other key religious figures of Islam, Hinduism, and Christianity, they not only proclaim themselves as the messengers of God, but in some cases, they even proclaim themselves to be the God or the supreme God. Dr. Ambedkar wrote in his essay that the key religious figures of other 3 religions constantly project themselves as the messengers of God and as the equivalent of God themselves, whereas Buddha, on the other hand, never arrogated to himself any such status. Dr. Ambedkar argues that this distinction allowed Lord Buddha to draw a clear difference between being a Margadata and between being a Mokshadata. Ambedkar says that Lord Buddha was satisfied in just being a Margadata, meaning the one who would show the path towards moksha or towards nirvana, whereas the key religious figures of other religions proclaim themselves to be the Mokshadatas and thus demand complete subservience without any scope for questioning their ideas and their philosophies. This, according to Ambedkar, gives enough opportunity for reform within Buddhism, where difficult and controversial socio-political questions can be raised, and this provides an opportunity to fight inequality within the system. According to Ambedkar, other religions are founded on the basis of promoting inequality, as they largely demand blind faith as compared to the focus on reasoning and experience in Buddhism. Ambedkar compared the four religious teachers of all the four religions, and he states that the religious figures of Hinduism, Islam, and Christianity claim their teachings to be supreme and infallible, whereas Buddha, on the other hand, claimed no such infallibility. And in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, he told his disciple Ananda that they should not accept his teachings as correct and they should not blindly follow his teachings and philosophies. Instead, he asked his followers to be guided by reasoning and their own personal experience, and they were even free to modify or even to abandon some of his teachings. It is this element of liberty and scope for reform which was available within Buddhism that inspired Dr. B.R. Ambedkar to eventually embrace Buddhism. He also points out that other religions, especially Hinduism, is largely based on obedience to rituals, and the concept of dharma in Hinduism has a very narrow interpretation. Dr. Ambedkar wrote in this essay that the concept of dharma in Hinduism calls for blind following of rituals and for blind acceptance of the laws and doctrines that have been laid out. Whereas in Buddhism, Lord Buddha drew out a distinction between dharma and dhamma, and according to Ambedkar, ritual-based worship has been rejected and morality-based following has been promoted. All these factors led Ambedkar to conclude that in the other religions, inequality could be easily bred as it favors the powerful, whereas Buddhism, on the other hand, creates opportunities for reform because of its liberty, which allows the followers to raise even radical and controversial socio-political questions, thus leading to better fulfillment of one's spiritual needs. Now let's take up a column from page number 7, which has been written by a member of parliament representing the South Chennai parliamentary constituency. In this column, the MP is trying to highlight the plight of sex workers in India. See, in India, sex work has been criminalized, and this leads to a lack of recognition of their basic rights, especially labor rights, and thus directly contributes to their lack of socio-economic welfare and even to their abuse and exploitation. So in this context, the writer is making a case for the decriminalization of sex work, along with guaranteeing a set of basic labor rights to sex workers so that their dignity and well-being could be protected. See, any form of sex work in India has been declared as a criminal act with heavy penalties under the provisions of the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act of 1956, which has even been amended several times. See, in most modern and liberal democracies, the thinking is that criminalization of sex work leads to more problems, which directly affects the rights and the well-being of the sex workers. The act of criminalization creates a stigma around this profession, and it pushes all forms of sex work underground, where the sex workers have to face abuse not just from their clients and from the middlemen who control the business, but even from the police authorities. It snatches away all rights from them and even directly leads to their harassment, even going to the extent of facing violence, and also makes the sex workers more vulnerable to a variety of diseases, especially sexually transmitted infections. So that's the reason why many Western democracies have moved towards decriminalization of sex work, and few countries have even gone to the extent of recognizing their basic labor rights. See, the motivation of a society or a country to declare sex work as criminal work is entirely driven by the question of morality. In most conservative orthodox societies, sex work is considered to be inherently immoral, and the society and the state takes it upon itself to rescue women from sex work. While it is absolutely essential for the state to rescue minor girls from sex work, the same argument cannot be made with regard to adult sex workers. Because here, the argument is that the right over one's body is an individual right. Neither the state nor the society has a right to interfere in the way in which an individual decides to use their body, and hence it's very essential to create a distinction between forced sex work and willful sex work. In fact, even the Justice J.S. Verma Commission, which was set up after the Nirbhaya gang rape incident, came to the same conclusion, and it recommended to the government to create a clear-cut distinction between forced sex work, which is a result of trafficking and kidnapping, and willful sex work, where adult sex workers willingly take up this profession to sustain their livelihood and to improve their economic status. Of late, even the Supreme Court of India has been thinking on these lines. And in the landmark Buddhadev Karmaskar vs. State of Bengal case of 2011, the Supreme Court opined that sex workers should be provided with right to dignity by the state by making a distinction between forced sex work and willful sex work. This calls for policymakers to look at sex work from the labor perspective, and this approach would allow the society and the state to accord a set of basic labor rights to sex workers who are willingly taking up sex work as a profession to sustain their livelihood, which in turn guarantees them basic dignity and protects them from any violence and stigma. And in ongoing cases, if the Supreme Court were to recognize sex work as a right to livelihood, then it would go a long way in protecting the well being of the sex workers. Then, according to this article on page number 1 and 8, along the line of control between India and Pakistan, peace and normalcy has returned ever since the DGMOs of both the armies renewed their commitment to uphold the 2003 ceasefire. Over the last 3 months, infiltration attempts have gone down significantly, and this has brought a sense of normalcy and peace and stability to the border villages. Even though Indian security agencies have reported the presence of terror launch pads across the LOC, the complete absence of any infiltration attempt following this announcement in February comes as a huge breakthrough for the India-Pakistan relationship. There are also reports that indicate that Pakistan might have put in these efforts and it might have put on hold any support to infiltration attempts by terrorists in the light of the upcoming FATF summit in June. Because right now Pakistan is already on the grey list of FATF for failing to act against money laundering and terror financing. And as India is seeking to build pressure at the FATF to blacklist Pakistan, Pakistan might be trying to convey to India that it is serious about bringing down infiltration and terrorism against India by strictly enforcing the terms of the February agreement, which committed both the armies to uphold the 2003 ceasefire. Now let's look at the mains practice questions. The first question: write a note on Dr. B.R. Ambedkar's embrace of Buddhism. The second question: examine the demand for decriminalization of sex work along with a guaranteed set of basic labor rights for sex workers. Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.